I guess to kind of summarize things again, what we've tried to do, as we've done in other years, is we've tried to bring together a group of speakers who are on the front line of doing things and bringing new and different ideas to the table. I guess the general purpose of this open forum is to kind of cover what we've covered here all day and question or comment on what we've seen so far. So I guess what I'll do is we'll open the floor up and let someone begin asking questions. I said, give Ian the mic first.
So I want to ask a challenging question, which hopefully all of you are willing to answer. But in terms of policy, government policy, what do you see as the most significant change that we need in terms of governmental management of CWD in your various jurisdictions, or as broad as you feel you'd like to comment?
Yes, give it to you first.
So on the wildlife side, like I mentioned, we really are changing our direction and trying to work more towards management. We have a lot of limitations here in Saskatchewan, especially given the condition, how widespread this disease is in the province. It's extremely challenging to deal with it on an endemic level. But certainly we are looking at new policies and regulations to try to control the spread of the disease and minimize transmission risk. So it's going to be really challenging because we're going to need a lot of stakeholder support moving forward. So some of the things we talked about, reducing points of concentration, so baiting and feeding restriction, which is not going to be popular with certain groups. Of course, our outfitters rely a lot on baiting and feeding, and as does a lot of the hunting community. So support from outside organization stakeholders is going to be really critical. We talked about focusing on carcass movement, carcass disposal is a major issue on the wildlife side, as well as adaptive approaches to management. And when I mean adaptive, I mean having some means to monitor our management actions and the results. So we're looking at certain management strategies, whether that's density reduction or targeting bucks, the more infected classes, to try to minimize transmission risk. And that's all we can do, is just try to minimize transmission risk. We're not gonna eradicate the disease. So and all of these things are going to involve potentially regulatory changes, policy changes, and really, we need as many stakeholders as possible to support those initiatives. And we want to work with, we're going to need to do things to address this disease, not just on the wildlife side, of course, but also with the game farming sector. So we're going to want to work closely with you as well. Because we are still, like you said, we're having new game farms testing positive each year. It's still a major issue within the industry as well, so we have to tackle it from both angles.
Basic research. It's so important, and unfortunately with these diseases it's so bloody expensive to do. Expensive in dollars and expensive in time. Having facilities where we can infect animals. This sounds silly since it's happening naturally, in the cervid industry and obviously in free ranging, but for us to do this in a lab situation, we just don't really have those facilities to easily do that. So, First Nations people, we got a big issue coming there down the pipe there that needs to be considered big time.
I think the problem right now are the funding agencies, the governmental funding agencies, and you wouldn't believe that the NIH, and I've applied for many NIH grants. These people are openly support the prion and advise you not even to apply. That's got to change, and I think they should be more unbiased at that level. And it's crazy that the burden of funding this and curing this or fixing this problem is right now dependent on you all. I mean, you're going to have to jump in and support this effort at the low level, you know, and it needs money. There's no question about that. But we got to get the NIH involved. I mean, and once they see things happening, I think they'll shift and go ahead and support the research.
I'm going to be the devil's advocate here, and I'm going to support CFIA. Generally speaking, when you look at CFIA through all of agriculture and what they've done for agriculture in Canada with our international trading partners has been very positive. You know, we trade to hundreds of countries, and it's because of the regulations that CFIA have put in place for all of our products. So when we bring it back down to, you know, let's look at TB as an example. We've got a TB-free status in Canada, and they're maintaining it. How they maintain it is very, very restrictive. We ran through that one experience here in Alberta and Saskatchewan a year or so ago, which involved 20-some thousand animals based off of a single cow that got slaughtered down in the States and tested positive for TB. We went through the entire investigation process with that and demonstrated the few animals that were involved with it to be able to maintain the free status with TB in the bovine situation. Here in CWD, and the bottom line with TB is, yeah, there's a live test. We know it's not that good, but if you're involved in the testing for it and it comes back as you tested positive in a skin test, there's only one way to demonstrate that your herd isn't involved, and that's we got to take lymph nodes out of cattle, which means they've got to have dead animals and take lymph nodes out. So this compensation comes back to not any different than what's happening with CWD. Right now, the gold standard test is the OVEX. That's the earliest that we can detect active CWD in cervids. Any other test is going to have to be at least as good or better if it's going to replace it. So if we want to tell CFIA to lower their standards in order to accept a test that's less, then the ramifications come downstream from our international trading partners who are going to come back and argue saying, that's not good enough. And we're closing the border to you. They're closing the border to, China's closing the border for nothing. Give them a good reason. Say we've got a positive test that's a gold standard that we rely on, and this is the steps that we go through in order to maintain that. International trading partners accept that, and we're able to continue trading. We lower that down in some way, or convince CFIA to lower that down in some way. I would argue that our ability to trade internationally would be significantly affected. So is CFIA tough to deal with, and are they slow to move? Yes. But until we are able to come forward and give them good testing results that say that this is what we need to replace what the existing gold standard is, that's the challenge that we need to be able to present and convince CFIA.
I'll just kind of say something quickly. I find myself somewhere in the middle. I agree that that a lot of you guys will butt heads with the CFIA, but I'll reiterate the praise that I had earlier for essentially everything on the Canadian side of the border. Like, I think you guys generally are more forward thinking. I have a much easier time working with you guys, with the CFIA, and I feel like wildlife is more like, it's at least a more unified effort than we have down in the States. But I also think that, in some places, and CFIA has started to embrace this, in some places it doesn't make sense to depop. When 5 out of 10 deer or elk on the other side of the fence are positive, like, these are locations where we need to try to manage things on site. Wisconsin, parts of Saskatchewan and Alberta, Colorado, like, depopulating herds I mean, sure, it's a quick and easy fix and you pat yourself on the back, but we're not coming up with any solutions by doing that. And allowing individual farmers in some of those locations to try to manage it on their site, I think will provide a lot of information outside the fence too.
You're going to play the devil's advocate.
I'm going to play it. And I'm not a government employee.
No, I
Okay,
understand.
so I'm just taking this from,
Okay, I want to compare then our government organizations between here and New Zealand. New Zealand has TB in their red deer herd, 2 million animals. It's a known fact, it's not disputed. They send meat, antler products all over the world unimpeded. Okay. As to date, at this point, I am unaware of any meaningful CWD testing in their neighborhood. None. Okay? How, when we're seeing it pop up all over the world, is it the biggest exporter of deer products not required to test?
and I'll ask you the question back, as why is the rest of the international, our trading partners, not asking them the very same tough questions that they're asking of us?
Because their government stands up for them. And our government puts it on the producers, they don't put it on the rest of them. You've got CFIA who has spent $60 million plus in compensation depopulating farms, okay? And when you say, couldn't have we had some of that money for research? It's not CFIA doesn't do research. Well, wouldn't you think there's a bean counter somewhere that would say, hey, boys, we've spent $10, $15 million on this. Maybe we should hand some over to Canada Health, fund them to get a live test for this so we don't have to keep killing these guys' animals. No communication between government departments, and always on the producer. Let's make it tougher on the producer. You've got over 1,000 beef cattle in a brucellosis test where one cow had 1/4 of its udder show suspected for brucellosis. All the other tests, the 3 other tests that are done, were negative. We're the only country using scorched earth. It doesn't make any sense.
I'm not that familiar enough with the CFIA to say that I disagree. That we're the only country that takes this play. I would also argue that the New Zealand industry is probably more responsible for their success trading with international partners than the New Zealand government.
Because they've been allowed to have a revenue source and stream by getting backup from their government for export.
I'm going to disagree with you there, because the New Zealand government spends a lot of money on their government officials, specifically their ag minister and their prime minister, to travel to those countries, for example, like Korea and for China, and they make a lot of connections. Going once a year, you're not going to make those same inroads with the government. Their people are there probably once a quarter. So yeah, it's not the same.
And again, it's a strong industry in New Zealand. Strong industry.
Allowed to grow.
And consequently, the government listens to that industry, same way as the canola industry is a very strong industry here in Canada. And we're getting political response. We're getting the government to respond at a political level against China. Now, whether or not they're going to be effective or not is another question, but I'll stand by that. I think it's an industry push as opposed to strictly a regulatory. The government is pooping on everybody else.
Short of closing the container port where everything from China comes in, you will get no reaction from China. Big, yeah. On canola or anything else.
So you're over there, Chris.
I'm going to turn the question to something totally different here, but we talked quite a bit about caribou and the concern that's happening with them up in the north. And I just, thinking about the way that testing has been done in the past, this would be more an environmental question. Is there any testing being done on the caribou herds up now to sort of, to have a basis point, you know, to say, like, we know it wasn't here before it came from the south up, like starting from the north down? It seems like that would be a wise decision, but I'm, again, not a scientist, but.
That's a really good question. So the short answer is no, there's not enough being done. We have abysmal, you know, very sparse, if any, testing in the caribou. Part of that is because the caribou, you know, they're not very numbered. There's not a lot of people harvesting those caribou, the boreal caribou. So it's hard for us to get our hands on those samples. I would say that we even haven't had much testing in deer and elk in the caribou zone, and I think that may be a place to start to try to encourage more sampling. And a lot of that's, there's a lot of outfitted hunting in those areas. There's, you know, First Nations communities, and love to work more with them and others hunting in those areas to try to get more samples. But it's been a challenge, and we definitely would love to do some more testing because we don't know. It's possible that CWD is already there. We haven't detected it yet. We hope that's not the case, but of course, if you don't look, you don't find. So it's a really good question, and I think, you know, an area where we're really lacking in information there. So
I guess my concern would be, or maybe more of a suggestion would be, that if we test where the zones overlap, and this coming from a producer concern, is that they are always going to assume that CWD came from the south down. Now, we already know that CWD has showed up in an isolated herd in Norway and the caribou. So I guess, you know, and maybe this is something that maybe as an industry we need to support or whatever. There's lots of caribou killed in the north, and I'm not just talking about our boreal herd, I'm talking about the barren ground and the Quebec Labrador species and woodlands, or whatever you want to call them. You know, it would be, there should be a basis point established before they find it there.
yeah.
I mean, we've already said we assume it's going up, but that they're going to get it. But if we could say they didn't have it, you know, like, it just seems like they would, or they have it.
Yeah, and I should qualify that. So there is some surveillance happening in northern Saskatchewan and the Northwest Territories, and that's mostly being led by the government of the Northwest Territories. So they've been working with communities that hunt barren ground caribou in Saskatchewan and the NWT. So they're trying to do some surveillance to help answer that question exactly and see if it's potentially already there. But yeah, they're working towards that.
If we were in the U.S., I think your first answer would be, who's going to pay for it, right? And how do you pay for it? You know, do you add additional costs onto a license, and then you start to lose hunters? And you know, I think fortunately you guys here your government is a little bit more supportive of that sort of stuff. But right now in the U.S., who's going to pay for it? So,
at the very least, they should be collecting the samples and storing them so that at some point they could test and say, okay, that it was here or wasn't. That would be the, you know, the cheap way out. At least they could go back and say, well, we have the sample here to test.
Yeah, I was just going to say, yeah, we're not actually any better off than the U.S. as far as funding is concerned. So our CWD surveillance program is funded right now through the sale of hunting fishing licenses, so we get 30% of that revenue, and then that's split across the ministry. So a portion of that goes towards surveillance and a portion provided by agriculture as well. But it's nowhere near enough funding to support even, you know, building infrastructure in rural communities or in areas where we haven't done much surveillance. So it's a huge issue, and that's why, you know, when you look at the surveillance data, it's not complete. There's a lot of gaps, and yeah, more funding is needed. So.
I have one other question related to wildlife stuff, and I'm just curious: is there any research being done as far as what Nick does, you know, with our wild herd, as far as the, you know, the different ales? Like, are they actually doing any testing on that? It'd be interesting to know how that's affecting our wild herd. Like, if our certain areas of the province are actually, you know, have more of one gene pool or whatever than the other side of the province, or?
Yeah, so, being new to the province, I'm not sure I can really, I have to be careful because I think there's been some research done historically that I may not be aware of, that Jed actually may be more aware of in terms of genetics in the province. I think a lot of the work's been done in Alberta, but I'll let him comment in case you're...
A lot of this is work in progress, but the Coltman Lab and a grant my wife's in charge of through Genome Canada is doing exactly that. And they've looked at hundreds and hundreds of cervids and deer, elk, antelope, cervid, but bighorn sheep. So they're doing a lot of sequencing, and so that, yes, it is being done. I'm not prepared to give you a summary of that. I know the distribution genetics of mule deer and white-tailed deer, in Alberta was very similar to the genetic spread we saw when we did those studies back in Wisconsin many, many years ago.
So I'll just say I can't speak to Canada, but one of our additional aims with the Penn study is to essentially repeat what Deb did, 15 years ago in Wisconsin, in that same area in Wisconsin, to see, have the alleles changed in those areas where it's a 50% prevalence, and are we seeing more SS or K or H or whatever animals there? My prediction is that will be the case. My concern is that those studies at the time were done a little bit differently, and it may be hard to compare apples to apples, So, we'll do the best that we can, but that is ideally something that we'd like to do.
Wait a minute, was that a criticism or a study?
Well, no, it's a criticism of the fact that you...
I'm okay.
No, I just want to say it though.
I'm good.
It's a constant concern for all of us to be able to get the samples that you need, and I think Deb was limited in the samples she could get. So she had to do her study a certain way.
Okay, I'll take that. The general idea here is as the disease progresses in an area, as it's affecting susceptible deer, are we getting a change in genetics with time? And that's a likely result, we think, in the wild, but to be determined, and I think you're on it.
Sorry, Ralph, I'm going to cut you off for a second here, but I'm going to make in this topic about government involvement in this, I'm going to make an observation, a comment, just as a matter of interest to everybody. 2 weeks ago, Iga and myself attended a conference of the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters, and they put on a CWD seminar similar to this, 2 days in length. That tells me that it's not in Ontario yet, but they're very concerned about what's going on there because it is now in Quebec and on the borders of Ontario. I'm interested to see what's going to happen on a larger scale with this, because this has always been a disease that has been a Western Canadian problem. And now this is hitting the homeland in Ontario and Quebec where all the voters are. And I'd be interested to see if this makes a difference and how it gets looked at. Whether it does or not, I don't know. I'm just bringing that up to see where it's going to go.
Are fish susceptible?
No.
Not as far as I'm aware.
Wasn't there a fish prion disease reported like 5 years ago? It was either in Italy or in Spain.
Nothing reproducible.
There's been a lot of fishy things that have happened along with this along the way.
Back to the domestic
Go ahead, Rob.
scene then. Nick, what you were talking about sheep, I believe in your, yes. So we were told that there's in endemic herds of deer, there's 40 to 50% infection rate. What was the maximum that sheep ever had in their flocks?
That's a good question. I may not be able to speak very well, but I would assume that there were herd flocks of sheep that had upwards of 50, 60, 70, 80%, depending on the genetic background of those herds. I can't say specifically, but I would guess that's the case. If anybody knows differently or the same.
In the Ontario and Quebec, scrapie investigations generally 30 to 40% positives in a positive herd or flock, but it will vary. Sheep have some very specific genetic resistance to scrapie, and so the rate at which it's endemic in each flock will differ based on the genetic profile of those animals.
Some of our larger cases of depopulations in the U.S. can partly be ascribed to ongoing legal challenges. Let's just say that the depopulations were delayed for several years while the lawyers fought it out. And the case in Iowa, we found 80% prevalence. I mean, if they depopulated 2 years early, it probably wouldn't have been that high. So.
Well, sheep had, what, 300-400, maybe 1,000 years to build resistance to that, maybe?
Well, I think the domestication process has helped that greatly. How many different breeds of sheep are there out there from which we can choose from? We essentially have white-tailed deer, and there's northern white-tailed deer and Texas white-tailed deer, and and not a lot of, they've only been domesticated for a century or two at most, and more intensely in the past 30 or 40 years. So I think that partly attributes why there's so much variation in sheep.
So from your point of view, from knowing the genetic history of sheep, and how would you recommend, or would you think that the domestic deer and elk industry should move towards and the jury's still out on the resistance factor and the shedding and what all goes on there. Should we, in your opinion, start trying to go to more resistant type genetics in our herds?
I can speak for what I would do. If I were new in the deer farming industry, I would want to have deer with these markers, just based on what I'm seeing in the depopulations. What you decide to do, and there are so many factors that you need to consider as far as live animal testing and animal movement and all this sort of stuff that you need to consider. It complicates things. I've had talks with Dennis and other people about, right now, these are the ones that we think are the most resistant, but, we're at a very early stage of this game, and I'm seeing exactly what happened in the sheep world when some of these markers were discovered. People started going out and looking and finding more and more and more. And, we're just kind of beginning that stage where maybe there are others. Like I said, we found 3 other markers. We have no idea how susceptible or resistant they are because they weren't in any of our depopulations. They're in private herds. But maybe, I think it's worth casting that net and looking to see what we can find. Because the more we look, the more we find, and maybe we'll find something that will have complete resistance. But
more comments from the panel?
Yeah, I'm just going to encourage everybody that's in this along those lines is that we're starting to go down that road of developing some live testing that allow you to make some management decisions on how you select and retain animals or buy animals into your herd situation. Any little management change that you make is going to make a difference. Every other species that's been out there have proven that. Anytime something is coming along and they've decided to start selecting, let's say it's in the cattle industry, we want to select on fertility rates. Preg checking is a huge part of that decision-making process that they go through. Animals are culled because they're not their second year or third year they're not carrying another calf with them. You can go through all sorts of the criteria that they're using to make their herds better and better and better. A lot of them are very small changes that they make. And I'm going to say here, this is one opportunity within the elk industry to start making some small changes with genotyping, with RAM testing. That you can. The trick is now going to be on your side to figure out how would I include that into my management, and what could be the ramification downstream? That's not something that, you know, Nick or myself or the ag agent, your ag agent in town is going to be able to tell you, say, well, let's do this. It's going to be industry driven. That's when we have the best results.
The only thing I can say is that obviously I think we should be going in another direction, and I think it's up to you to at least get it off and get some preliminary stuff done so we can get the government involved again.
Frank, while I have the mic then, does it make sense to you that from your theory there, very interesting theory it is, that but does it make sense to you that the sheep, by selecting their genetics, have sort of overcome the problem?
Well, you know, that's a possibility, obviously, and I think even the data from way back indicated that you inoculate all the animals, 40–50% come down with it, and you know, I just mentioned that because there's been always an interest in that approach. But I think for the immediate future, we have to go after the organism. And we can get a preventive vaccine and diagnostics. And in human health, we desperately need diagnostics and especially therapy and so forth. So I think we got to go in that direction.
But for my individual farm, would I be wise to upgrade genetics to go with the sheep?
Well, I think that's one option, but I think we could come up with a preventive vaccine, injectable vaccine, nasal vaccine, fairly soon if we get going on this.
You've had 30 freaking years to get going on it. We used to call the prion hypothesis the prion hypothesis. We don't call it the hypothesis anymore. It's defined. We know that this is what causes the disease. Regarding your question, clearly, I think Nick's touched on this. You obviously got to be careful when you're selecting for something that you're not getting rid of something as well. But it sure makes a heck of a lot of sense that if you got animals that are resistant to this disease, that's what you'd be working with.
So, maybe I missed it, but we've got a folded prion, or protein, that's called prion, that's causing the damage, right?
Correct.
What's the causative agent to make it fold?
You need two routes, I guess. One is you need an infection to begin with. So you need abnormal protein in the first place.
But where does the abnormal protein come
from?
From the environment or from another infection?
Yeah.
And it couldn't be, it couldn't be...
I'll give it to you in a second.
It couldn't be spurred by a bacteria?
Keep going, Judge.
We do get spontaneous form, the sporadic CJD. It's believed, which...
Hold on, be careful. You are saying that CWD could be spontaneous.
It could be. Nobody on here would deny that. There could be spontaneous forms of
I got a bunch of people in CFIA that'll deny that.
Okay, remember the microphone, the camera's holding there, so it'll be recorded.
Let me just, sporadic CJD, we don't know what the cause is. If you live long enough and have enough people, 1 in a million per year.
Right.
Atypical BSEs are believed to be a spontaneous form, at least that's a suggestion, because you get some old cattle. It is possible what's going on in Norway, old moose, maybe. My problem with going down that route too much is that we are dealing with an infection, and you get an animal exposed to abnormal protein, they will generate more abnormal protein, accumulate abnormal protein. With deer, it starts in the lymph system, and eventually you see it in the brain, and that's very clear. So that's the answer. Is it possible for us for an old animal for this to be spontaneous? Yeah, it's possible. It really doesn't explain the spread in North America. It might explain the origin originally, perhaps, in Colorado and Wyoming.
One thing is that spontaneous generation just doesn't fit with my view of infection. And in fact, I was at a meeting, a CWD meeting in Montana, and one of the researchers presented material using this PMCA test, which I questioned as well. But anyway, the control was positive. So he said, well, that's just spontaneous generation. Why put in controls at all? You know, this sort of thing. Pasteur essentially dealt with the idea of replicating crystals and spontaneous generation, and I thought he ruled it out with the germ theory. But anyway, and by the way, the folding, the actual mechanism of folding of the prion is conjecture. I mean, there's no scientific data that shows that that's the way it happens.
I'll just go back to the spontaneous CWD idea. You know, the problem is we have 9,999 cases of transmissible CWD for potentially every one spontaneous, and how do we tell the difference? And you know, the difficulty with atypical and classical scrapie is that, you know, once we started getting rid of the classical scrapie, then the atypical started to become more apparent because it became the more common. And the atypical BSE compared to the classical BSE, like once we started tamping down classical BSE, once we stopped feeding cattle rendered cow parts that were treated at 3,500 degrees Celsius to destroy any living thing other than this protein, then the atypical form of BSE started to become more prevalent and more recognized. So, you know, like I said, the problem is right now that there are 9,999 cases of classical CWD for every potential one case of spontaneous, perhaps, CWD. So we can't see the forest for the trees.
Question in the back, I believe Dennis. You got the microphone.
So, question for Dr. Stasiak. Just your presentation, there had been a point that you said one of the potential focuses in Dr. Stasiak's presentation was that there might be a focus on on increasing buck harvest. What would be the purpose of that, other than it would just reduce genetic, base in the population? That's not what you do to knock a population down or anything.
Exactly. So the purpose of that would not be to reduce the population, but typically in CWD endemic areas, the most infected cohort are older bucks. So the theory is if you can reduce that cohort, the most infected animals, then you're going to reduce the infection rates in the population. So it's a different strategy than reducing densities of deer.
Okay, cool.
Okay, we're just going to move the microphone over to the other side of the room. Back there.
The question was kind of, you know, how do we know what to do right now with our herds? We're breeders. We need to know what to do immediately. What can we do now while everything's getting sorted out? And I'd like somebody out there to answer me this question, but it doesn't matter whether it's a spiroplasma or it's a prion. the depopulation studies are showing us that those animals are resistant. So in the short term, I just can't see anything negative in us breeding these animals that are showing up in the depopulations as either no prevalence at all or an extreme reduced prevalence. It just seems like this is the only logical thing for us to do right now until somebody with a lot more smarts than the rest of us figures out what the root cause is and what else we can do about it. Can any of you tell me that there's anything that we can do better? If not resistance, what can we do right now?
I have my feelings. I want to hear your guys' feelings because I think it's important that, like, I want to hear what the objections to resistance are because like I said, I have my feelings, but. Yeah, the rest of the panel.
You mean what to do in terms of how to control the disease in the game farming industry? Is that?
Right, we're behind the fence and we're where we are today. And we've got some evidence that, just talk. We've got some evidence that we can breed out of this, at least to a point where we're going to buy some time and we're going to get our prevalences or our possibility of picking it up way dramatically reduced. I just can't see where any of us can look at this as anything but a positive to do it. Unless you guys got some magical thing we can do other than that, I don't see where we have any other options.
Right. So as far as breeding within the game farming industry, I can't really comment to that. I think, that if that's what you want to do, that's fine. From a wildlife perspective, that doesn't really bother us. When it comes to any sort of, selective breeding or genetic manipulation in the wild, that's a whole other issue, and that's something that we're not supportive of because of concerns over, deleterious effects or dilution of adaptive genes in the environment and how that might impact how those animals respond to their environment. So, but as far as, breeding within the industry, that's kind of outside of my purview, I'd say. I'm sure there are other things there are other things we've discussed. So of course we recognize the concerns over environmental contamination and wildlife infection around a lot of these game farms. So are there things we can do in terms of, fencing, for instance? One of the options that has been discussed in the past is, secondary fencing, and that might reduce the direct contact. It's not necessarily going to reduce environmental contamination. Looking at areas for, if you're planning to start a new game farm, maybe there's some areas of the province that are just so highly infected where we might not want to, issue new licenses because of the levels of contamination. But I really shouldn't, speak too much further to that because it's really kind of outside of the wildlife purview. But I think we want to work with game farmers to try to reduce infection rates and do what we can on the wildlife side to try to minimize those risks. But being aware that there's concerns and risks on both sides.
It's interesting, in Michigan we've got a TB zone and we tested some animals for genotype in the TB zone, and we found that there's some pretty good markered animals in the TB zone, and within another zone within the state almost all of the animals are GS or SS, and we're proposing with the DNR and the Department of Agriculture there that we look at managing the wild population in a different way. As far as when we're going to harvest heavy, let's not harvest heavy in the areas where the resistance is high, or where there's no resistance, then take the animal point restrictions off and make heavy doe harvests where we make room for the areas where we've got some resistance in the wild to proliferate and start to fill in those areas. But we're looking at these animals that we're seeing in the wild. They're great, big, beautiful bucks that hunters harvested. We're not seeing anything that we should be afraid of as far as proliferating them a little bit. We're trying to change the way our wildlife managers are looking at managing our wild deer just based on resistance that's already there.
Right. Yeah, and in terms of wildlife, we look at cumulative impacts on wildlife and don't typically manage on one trait or one gene basis just because there's so many elements. And so it's not something that we would really look at implementing in a wild population, but I think there's merit certainly in captive herds.
I'll be interested to tell you how it works in Michigan in the next few years.
Sure. Yeah, it'd be interesting.
There is a bit of, I agree with the farm. I have an issue with free-ranging deer and the genetics. And there have been numerous studies, prion studies on this in the past. Glenn hinted at one earlier today, and that's the ability for this agent to adapt to different genetics. So in the process of taking 96 and making it the major stockholder, you may end up with the same problem later, an agent that's adapted to 96 and the 96 becomes susceptible. Now this is more theory than anything else, other than we've seen it numerous times in the lab where the agent does adapt. So I don't look at that as a 100% it's gonna work scenario. I'm just throwing a bit of caution in that direction because we have seen the effect I've described.
We just to carry that on a little bit farther, and I've talked to lots and lots of people about this. And the only question that I keep coming back to is, you know, we've been breeding the sheep resistant now for 15 or 20 years, and we haven't seen anything where scabies has, you know, changed at all or mutated to react to the additional genetics.
That's a great point, and a point in your favor. But again, those sheep tend to be resistant to scrapie. I mean, as opposed to an animal that, to use the waterproof watch, I mean, it is not completely resistant, which is what we're dealing with, I think, with the 96 animals.
I think that's true. Yeah, like there's room for there's obviously room because we don't have that many double marker animals to look at, KK or HH animals to look at. I mean, the way that scrapies worked, like you add one, it's good. You add two, it's even better. That's what the hope is, that an HH animal is going to be better than an HG, and a KK is going to be better than a KG. But we don't know how much better, and that's why we need to do the pen study, Dennis, so that we can see, is this worth it? How much value is this going to add? How much risk is going to come from this? So, and to just say that, you know, we shouldn't do this because this might happen, that's what I've heard for the past 5 or 10 years. We shouldn't do this because this might happen. You know, we're reaching the point in some places, this province included, where, you know, we need to try something, right?
When you're looking at some of the work that we saw up here as far as extending out the lifespan of those animals before they start showing disease, well, if we get animals that are out at 6 years, 7 years, or 8 years out, and we're harvesting before that, what's going to end up happening with the disease naturally is that we've eliminated it, right? We've got animals, we're getting rid of them before they're infectious and spreading the disease on further. How do we get there? I know, and that's the question. That's what the industry is going to have to see. You're going to have to sit down and look at your own herds. Take a look at some of the testing materials that you have to use for management. You've got some genotyping that you can take a look at. I'm just talking as a producer here now, as a cattle producer. If I had an opportunity to be able to select for gene types that were going to be resistant and started pushing my herd that way a little bit, I know I'm going to find some other attributes that aren't what I want. It's okay, this is my primary one, right? I'm looking for calving ease, and I'm focusing strictly on calving ease on my heifers that go down. I know I don't get terminal weights that I would like to have on these heifers that on their first calves that come on the ground, but that's okay because I'm focused on something else. That's the mentality and the thought process that needs to be going on at this level, right? You guys and ladies are the ones that need to sit down and take a look at the tools that you have available for you now, and they are different, and start looking to see what thing. If your end goal is to try to increase the longevity of these animals before they're infected or infectious, and then having them sold before that, that's a change possibly in the whole way that the industry is managed. Then those are some of the things that you may need to be doing. In the meantime, there may be some breaks in the disease process and understanding it, how to do it. Maybe there's a treatment that comes up, maybe there's a vaccine that comes into play that allows us to handle the disease even better and push that out further. So, but it's still probably going to end up coming down to a point of, at some point, we got to sell these animals or get them off the place before they're infectious. And right now, we may only have a couple of small tools that we can look at. One of them is gene typing. One of them may be using a RAML test. Am I going to bring an animal onto my property that has never had a RAML test onto it? Or are you going to gamble that it does? You got an 80% test here that's going to say it's negative. You got genotyping that you can turn around and look at and say, I'm selecting heavily for LL bulls or LM bulls at the very least. I'm never having another MM animal on my property that's coming into place. Those are some pretty, they're major management changes, but those are just a couple of instances to show how some of this management might be brought into play.
But the problem might be that, and speak to this if you will, that the LL and the MM get infected at the same time through contact or offense or whatever else, and it just and they progress through. The MM gets sick quicker, but they're both shedding prions or whatever infectious material at the same time, and the LL lives to be 8 years old and has shed prions for the last 6 years before.
Well, I guess that's the question: are they shedding?
Well, that's so.
Certainly now, when we get our live testing that's going on, that's where we're trying to determine where is that tissue placed, other than an OBEX where it's collecting in the lymph nodes in the brain. We know it's collecting there. Is it shedding anyplace else? When it's really sick, yes, it's in the urine, it's in the feces, it's in the saliva, it's everything. But someplace along between there, where does that even start happening? Because I don't think
We have several lines of anecdotal, I would call anecdotal information, where we've looked at these samples from 4 or 5 animals, and the controls are terrible, and so we have, that's the only crutch we have to rely on right now, and it suggests that some data suggests that the less susceptible animals start shedding at a later time point, and that makes sense with everything that I know about infectious diseases. If it takes an animal longer to show clinical signs, typically the entire disease process is extended, and they're shedding at a later time too. But cumulatively, yeah, the concern is that an LL animal, maybe they don't start shedding until they're 4, but they die when they're 8. They're still potentially shedding for 4 years. But if they're dead by the time they're 3, what does it matter, right? That's what I think that we need to consider management on top of all of this.
Okay, we got about 3 minutes left if there's any further questions.
Yeah, I got one more question about there. There's some numbers that
You could probably clarify this for me. Again, it's about our wildlife herd. No, correct me if I'm wrong, when you were showing your graphs there, that when the prevalence in the wild reaches 40 to 50%, that we're going to see a decrease in our herd 10.4% per year, I think is what it said. Now, the math to that would be that in 10 years in that area, the deer are all dead. Now, we've already had, let's use the Sask Landing for an example, where they know it was already relatively high back when they first started doing their original culls. And now we've seen the herd, I've spent lots of time there, it's increased over time. Even with hard persecution, still by tags and doe killing, the numbers are still slowly growing. These numbers don't quite line up to what they're saying with the prevalence of 50% and 10.4% decrease in the herd a year.
Right. So the study you were referring to was out of Wyoming, and that was in white-tailed deer. So they found that 10.4% annual decline, and they did conclude that the population was eventually going to be locally extirpated if harvest was maintained at the same level. So the question is, okay, we've got similar prevalences in Saskatchewan or some areas like Sask Landing, even higher than that, estimated around 40%. Why haven't we seen the population declines? So part of the answer is we haven't done a lot of comprehensive population surveys to really document declines. So stretching back 10, 15 years ago compared to now. The populations do seem to be relatively stable, but that specific area, it's along the river valley. It's a perfect habitat for deer in the wintertime. We know we're seeing significant mortality, so maybe it's a sink where there's a lot of deer dying, but there's new recruits coming into the area, so it's a theory. Maybe we're seeing changes in age-sex structure, so maybe we're seeing younger deer. We haven't really done the population surveys to be able to kind of really characterize that. So there may be many different reasons why we haven't seen the declines. There's a lot of deer movement across the landscape, so maybe new deer, are just kind of coming back into that area.
Okay, I've seen this study on mule deer movement that the Sask government did, actually, that was produced in Game Warden magazine. When they collared their deer, they should be able to answer that question themselves. They actually did, what percentage of the fawns were leaving and how far they were going and what the furthest buck traveled. So and then of course each zone has a harvest level. So where each zone is managed individually.
Right.
So that kind of is counterproductive. And I guess my concern is that when they have these things come on and you present and you say 10.4, and it wasn't you, but it was Wisconsin, but you present that, I would be, as a hunter or anybody else, be super concerned that deer are going extinct in 10 years. And actually from what you just said, that's actually not true. And you just said, because what we're experiencing actually doesn't say that. So we're getting kind of
so part of it is the data is not complete. So our harvest data is not complete. We don't have mandatory harvest reporting. So not every hunter reports their harvest. So it's possible that there's been decreases in harvest in the area and population level impacts that we just haven't documented. So moving forward, when we talked about management, we're looking at maybe going towards mandatory harvest reporting and population surveys in those areas so we can actually answer those questions. And then as far as the movement studies, those deer that you were referring to had been collared in that area, and the movement was shown away from the river valley. So they weren't really looking at deer coming into the valley, potentially.
Maybe moving forward, you shouldn't make statements that aren't backed up by statistics.
With wildlife management, we make decisions based on the best available science and data that we have, and it's not always perfect. So even when I talk about our harvest reporting, sometimes that's the best evidence we have. So it's certainly not perfect. Often, our estimates, our population estimates, there's not a definitive amount. So we try to make the most informed decisions based on the information we have.
Okay, I think
I just want to say
one last comment. You got the last word.
I just want to say one thing, or a couple things quick, actually. So that model doesn't take a couple things into account. If you were to put a fence around that herd, 10% is exactly what would happen, not considering animals moving in. The other thing that model didn't consider was the genetic background of the animals too, and is there a decline in GG animals and a rise in SS animals, and so the main point is that at the time that study was done, some of this information wasn't available, so they had to use that, and they came up with the best model they could with the best information they had at the time. And as science moves on, we come up with more information. And so the next model, they'll consider the mule deer movement that you mentioned. They'll consider the genetic structure of the herd. And they won't get it right that time either, because there'll be more information by the time they get done that suggests that maybe they should do something else. But the point is, just like Dr. Stasiak says, that they're using the best information they have at the time, and let's hope for better information next time.
I guess the point that I was trying to make with all those comments was, and I just want to summarize that, is that the general public, what you see on 306 Hunter Saskatchewan, whatever, when they see that, it's a negative thing around CWD, but it's very negative, but it always points back
to the deer industry and the deer movement and everything like that. So when comments are like that made, they should end it just how you said it. That in 2 years from now, this will not be the same. In 4 years from now, we will know more. When you leave, when you see the presentations that are done, I've listened to them all on YouTube, they do not say that. So then, if I'm just Low Joe hunter or a wildlife enthusiast, I come out of there going, this is the end of the white-tailed deer. They're gone in 10 years.
Well, even I do. So it's not just you, Joe Blow Hunter. I see that, and your immediate reaction is to panic.
Right.
Fake news.
Well, I mean, I don't want to seem like it's an attack on environment, because I get it, they're doing what they can do, but I mean, it needs to be, clarified that this is the science that's best at the time, and that it won't be the same in 2 years from now. That leaves a lot different perspective to the average person listening to that, which doesn't create a bunch of fear-mongering amongst people that you read and see and hear all over the place. So, anyways.